The room fell silent, but not for her. The boardroom was alive with noise, the kind of noise that dripped with entitlement. Laughter echoed off the marble walls, deep and smug, like a private joke only the elite understood. Designer watches flashed in the fluorescent light as hands gestured wildly. Men, all men, dressed in expensive tailored suits, lounged around the long oak conference table like kings at a feast. They weren't worried. They never were. It was 8:57 a.m. on a Monday at Beckett & Rowe, one of the most powerful consulting firms in the city, maybe the country. And the energy in that room wasn't just casual. It was calculated. These men were playing a game, and they were convinced they were winning. Did you see the numbers from last quarter? One chuckled, slapping another on the back. Please, the other scoffed. We crushed it. Even when we mess up, we come out on top. The CFO, a man named Graham Langford, sat at the head of the table, legs crossed, an overpriced espresso in hand. His salt and pepper hair was styled with surgical precision, and his tone had the slick confidence of someone who had been obeyed for far too long. He was telling a story, some half-funny anecdote about a junior associate who accidentally deleted an important client file when the heavy double doors creaked open. Nobody turned to look. Nobody paused. Nobody cared. She entered quietly, her heels making soft but steady clicks across the pristine marble floor. Dressed in a sharply cut navy pantsuit, she walked with the calm composure of someone who didn't need to prove anything. In her hands was a slim black folder, organized and purposeful. Her name tag clipped to her lapel read, Elena Ross. But no one noticed. She paused a moment, just inside the doorway. A few of the men glanced over, but not at her face. They scanned her outfit, her skin, her presence. No recognition. No welcome. She cleared her throat gently and spoke, voice poised and professional. Excuse me, I believe this is the 9 a.m. strategic review meeting? Langford didn't even lift his eyes from his cup. Without hesitation, he muttered, "Oh, catering's in the back," and waved a hand vaguely toward the kitchenette. Laughter rippled around the room. One executive smirked and said, "Don't forget the muffins this time." Another clapped sarcastically, mumbling, "A little early for jokes, but that one was decent." Still, she didn't flinch. Not even a twitch. She stood there, expression unreadable, refusing to be rattled. "I'm not catering," she said evenly. "I'm Elena Ross, Interim Director of Organizational Strategy. I'm here to present the restructuring proposal." That silenced the room. Slowly, reluctantly, some heads turned toward her. A few of the men exchanged confused glances, as if they were checking with each other to confirm they heard correctly. "Elena who?" one of them mumbled. Langford finally looked up, blinking, his smug expression faltering ever so slightly. "You're the new strategist?" She nodded once. "Funny," he said, leaning back in his chair. "I wasn't informed we were bringing in outside consultants for this level of discussion." His words were sharp, but his tone was sharper. It wasn't about information. It was about power. And Elena understood that immediately. Still, she didn't react. Not with outrage. Not with sarcasm. She didn't rush to defend her credentials. Didn't list her degrees or her previous accomplishments, those she easily could have. She simply stepped forward, placed her folder gently on the table, and began organizing her notes. Just then, the door opened again. This time, heads did turn. It was David Marshall, the CEO. Tall, stern, and always 10 steps ahead. Marshall was known for being precise with his decisions and brutal with his time. When he entered a room, it wasn't noise that followed, it was gravity. "Morning," he said briskly, walking to the far end of the table. "Let's get started." He looked around the room, and then right at Elena. "I trust you've all met Elena Ross, our new interim director of strategy," he said. "She reports directly to me. She'll be leading today's review." Now the silence was different. It wasn't arrogant. It was awkward. The executives shifted in their seats. Some cleared their throats. One of them reached for a pen, like it might give him something to do with his hands. Langford coughed and muttered something under his breath that no one asked him to repeat. Elena stood tall, calm and centered. She didn't gloat. She didn't smirk. She didn't say, "Told you so." Instead, she opened her folder, clicked her remote, and began her presentation. Slide 1. A company at the crossroads. As the first chart illuminated the screen, there was no denying it. She was the most prepared person in the room. They had laughed. They had ignored her. They had humiliated her without hesitation. But now she had the floor, and she wasn't going to waste a single second of it. "I'm not catering," she said, her voice as even and composed as if she were speaking to a trusted colleague. "I'm here to present on the restructuring initiative." For a split second, it was as if her words didn't register. The room, which had moments ago roared with confidence and laughter, hesitated, not out of respect, but out of sheer confusion. The energy didn't shift because they recognized her authority. It shifted because they couldn't quite believe what they were hearing. A few heads turned now, reluctantly. Faces filled with surprise, skepticism, and something far less professional. Disbelief that this poised, confident black woman was not someone delivering coffee and pastries, but someone commanding the next major phase of the company's direction. Langford finally looked up from his espresso, his brows tightening, his eyes squinted slightly, not because he was trying to understand, but because his brain was racing to reconcile what he was seeing with what he thought he knew. "You're?" he asked slowly, the word hanging in the air like an accusation. "Elena Ross," she answered, maintaining eye contact. "Interim Director of Organizational Strategy." There it was. A pause. A silence so thick you could almost feel it press against your chest. But this wasn't the kind of silence that came from awe or admiration. This was the kind of silence that exposed the uncomfortable undercurrent of every system that resists change, and every person who dares to challenge it. A few of the men shifted in their chairs, side eyes darting around the room like they were silently asking, "Did you know about this? Who approved this?" Someone whispered, not even attempting to hide their doubt. The question wasn't just about process. It was laced with contempt, as if Elena's presence alone disrupted their entire understanding of what power looked like, what leadership sounded like, and who deserved to stand at the head of the table. "That's what happened. I did," came a firm voice from the back of the room. Heads whipped toward the door. Standing there, sharp suit and all business expression, was David Marshall, the CEO himself. His presence filled the space instantly. He wasn't a man who wasted time, and he certainly wasn't a man who entertained pettiness. "She reports directly to me," he said, stepping inside. Just like that, the mood collapsed. The false confidence, the chuckles, the smug looks gone, replaced with an eerie, shuffling silence as a wave of discomfort moved through the group, like an invisible hand flipping the atmosphere inside out. Mouths shut, hands dropped from coffee cups. One man, who had just been about to speak, slowly sank into his chair like a balloon losing air. Not a single apology. Not a single "sorry for the confusion." Not even the bare minimum, a polite nod of acknowledgement. They didn't apologize, because deep down, they didn't feel they had to. That's the thing about power when it's been unchallenged for too long. It becomes entitlement. And entitlement rarely admits when it's wrong. Elena scanned the room, not in defiance, but with composure. She wasn't here to battle egos. She was here to do her job. She had prepared for weeks, reviewed every department's metrics, studied inefficiencies, and designed a multi-phase rollout that could potentially save the company millions. She was the most qualified person in the room, and possibly the most disrespected. But still, she didn't flinch. Not once. Instead, she stepped forward confidently and placed her folder down at the far end of the conference table. With a simple press of a button, her PowerPoint presentation lit up the screen at the front of the room. David Marshall took a seat quietly, looking at her with a nod that said, "Go ahead. The floor is yours." She turned toward the room. "Today's review will focus on the proposed restructuring strategy for Q3 and Q4, she began. This initiative targets 3 core issues currently affecting performance, retention, and operational costs. Her voice was steady. No stumbles, no stammer, no sign of the cold reception she'd just received. But the men weren't really listening, not yet. Some scribbled half-hearted notes. Others kept glancing at each other, still processing the disruption of their internal hierarchy. One executive, clearly unsettled, tilted his chair back, and muttered under his breath, "Let's just get this over with." Elena heard it. She always did. But she didn't break stride, because she knew something none of them had figured out yet. She wasn't there to win them over. She was there to outperform them. Her presentation unfolded with precision. Clean slides, strong numbers, smart projections. She addressed anticipated objections before they could interrupt. Every question they might have asked, she had already answered, not for their benefit, but because it was her standard. As she wrapped up the overview and moved to the first key proposal, David Marshall leaned forward, clearly engaged. But the others? Still too stunned to realize they were being outclassed in real time. It wasn't until she clicked to a graph showing potential year-over-year savings, upwards of $18 million, that the first real stir happened. Someone finally said, "Wait, is that right?" Elena turned to him, meeting his eyes calmly. "Yes, the calculations are based on actual Q2 figures from your department. Page 6, if you'd like to verify." He blinked, flipped the folder open, and found she was absolutely right. There was power in her silence, power in not needing to prove herself, yet doing it anyway through preparation, discipline, and undeniable facts. They hadn't clapped when she entered. They didn't greet her with handshakes or smiles. But now, as the numbers stacked up, the projections grew stronger, and the logic became airtight. They listened, not out of respect, but because they had no choice. The lights dimmed slightly as the presentation began, the soft hum of the projector filling the room alongside the steady clicks of her slides. Elena stood at the front, tall, poised, composed. Her confidence didn't come from arrogance. It came from preparation, from the long nights she had spent reviewing the company's inefficiencies, from the quiet hours no one saw, where she rehearsed her strategy again and again to perfection. But the resistance in the room was immediate, loud in its silence. As she began to speak, her tone confident but never arrogant, she scanned the room with intent. Yet it was clear that most weren't really listening. Phones buzzed beneath the table. One executive even chuckled at a message and didn't bother hiding it. Another stirred his coffee with the urgency of someone trying to escape into it. The passive-aggressive disinterest wasn't just obvious, it was intentional. They weren't judging the plan. They were judging her. Every carefully structured point she made, dismissed with a glance or a sigh. Every chart she showed, picked apart, not with curiosity, but with condescension. When she presented a cost-saving strategy that could streamline overhead by 14%, one man, Thompson, head of operations, smirked and leaned back in his chair. "That's not how it works on the ground," he said. "You can't just drop numbers into a spreadsheet and expect the business to fix itself." Elena didn't flinch. She simply turned to page 8 of the packet. "You'll find those figures are based on last quarter's logistics data from your department. The spreadsheet is only reflecting what's already happening." His smirk vanished, but he didn't apologize. Then came the whispers. They were meant to be subtle, but they weren't. Too ambitious for someone who just got here. One executive murmured, just loud enough to be heard by everyone near him, especially her. Another rolled his eyes when she spoke about cultural shifts in leadership. Another values talk. Great. And then came the interruptions. She'd barely made it halfway through her next point when someone cut her off. "I'm sorry," Langford said, not sounding sorry at all. "But have you considered how these changes would impact legacy accounts? These are long-standing relationships." "I have," Elena replied calmly, "and I've already included a phased integration strategy that protects key accounts during the transition." She clicked to the next slide. There it was, right on the screen. Langford looked like he wanted to say more, but didn't. Instead, he leaned back with his arms crossed, lips pursed in a way that said this isn't over. Another exec raised a hand, feigning curiosity. "This is quite an aggressive plan. Wouldn't it make more sense for someone with more internal history to lead something this complex?" Elena met his gaze. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't blink. "The plan isn't aggressive. It's urgent. And your internal history is part of the reason the problems exist in the first place." The room fell still again. But this stillness felt different. Uncomfortable. Awkward. Like someone had cracked the surface of their illusion, and now the truth was leaking in. Still, there was no praise. No one nodded in appreciation. No hands clapped. Instead, they shifted in their seats, pretending to read documents they'd barely skimmed. They crossed arms, tightened jaws. It didn't matter how strong her data was. It didn't matter that her logic was sound or that her vision could actually help them. The wall had already gone up, and not a single one of them was trying to bring it down. It wasn't about her qualifications. It wasn't about her strategy. It was about the fact that she represented change, real change. And for a room full of men who had spent their careers perfecting comfort, predictability, and control, change was a threat. Elena knew this. She knew the wall wasn't made of stone or brick. It was made of fear. Fear of being exposed. Fear of having to evolve. Fear of being led by someone they never saw coming. Still, she didn't get defensive. She didn't push harder. She didn't demand their attention or plead for understanding. She did what powerful women have done for generations when their brilliance is ignored. She kept going. She finished every slide. She answered every question. She addressed every interruption with clarity and calm. And when she clicked to the final slide, a simple, clean statement that read, "Progress requires discomfort." She let it linger for a few extra seconds. Then, with poise and grace, she closed her folder. "That concludes the presentation. Thank you for your time," she said. No applause. No gratitude. Just more silence. But it wasn't the kind of silence that comes from victory. It was the silence of men who had just been outclassed and didn't know what to do about it. She gathered her things slowly, with intention. She didn't rush. Didn't hurry to leave like someone who had been dismissed. No. She walked out as if she had already won. Not the meeting, but the long game. No angry speeches. No grand exits. Just a quiet, confident walk to the door. Powerfully silent. And behind her, the room remained, eyes watching, minds turning, egos bruised. The wall they built to stop her had held for now. But even the thickest walls crumble when the foundation is shaken. And Elena, she just started the earthquake. By the time the clock struck noon, the office was buzzing. Not with productivity, but with speculation. The presentation was over, but the backlash had only just begun. In the break room, at standing desks, and in hushed hallway corners, the whispers took on a life of their own. No one dared say anything directly to Elena's face. But behind closed doors, the knives came out. "Who does she think she is?" One exec muttered over a salad he wasn't really eating. "Just waltzes in here with a flashy title and starts telling us how to run our departments?" "I heard she didn't even come from inside the company," another replied, leaning in like he was sharing state secrets. Probably one of those high-paid consultants who thinks they know everything. A third voice, lower and more venomous. "Let's be honest. It's a diversity hire. They needed to check a box and make the board happy. That's all this is." The words hung in the air like cigarette smoke, toxic, lingering, and hard to ignore. None of them knew Elena had graduated top of her class from Wharton. None of them knew she had been named Strategist of the Year by 2 different business journals. None of them knew she'd led the turnaround of not one, but 2 Fortune 500 companies, dragging them back from the edge of bankruptcy and into profitability. They didn't know because they hadn't bothered to ask. They hadn't read her resume. They hadn't read the internal memo David Marshall had sent out weeks ago, announcing her appointment and outlining her background, her experience, her accolades, her unmatched ability to fix what others had failed to see. No, because in their minds, none of that mattered. To them, she was an outsider. A woman in a power seat they believed they deserved. A black woman in a position they couldn't justify. Not in their heads, not in their culture, not in their narrative of who gets to lead. So instead of facing that truth, they whispered. Like children too afraid to confront the storm, they huddled together, hoping their doubt would drown her out. But Elena, she didn't waste a breath trying to correct them. She didn't send follow-up emails clarifying her credentials. She didn't engage in some public relations campaign to prove her worth. She let them whisper, let them second-guess, because Elena understood something they didn't. Power doesn't panic. She knew who she was. She knew what she was capable of. And she knew that the louder the whispers got, the more threatened they were by her presence. The same men who mocked her were now checking her LinkedIn profiles on private tabs. They were digging through company files to understand how she got there, searching for anything that would make them feel less unsettled. But they found nothing, because everything she had, she earned. And deep down, that terrified them. Back in her office, a sleek, quiet space 2 doors down from the CEO himself, Elena sat with her notebook open, not scribbling defensively, not reacting emotionally, but planning. Because while they whispered, she strategized. While they speculated, she executed. Elena wasn't concerned with being liked. She wasn't here to win over egos or ask for validation from people who had coasted on comfort and cronyism. She was here to fix the mess they didn't want to admit they'd made. Across the building, the conversations escalated. "I'd give her 2 weeks." One director laughed as he poured himself another coffee. "Once she realizes we don't play nice, she'll run. She's already out of her depth," another added. "You saw Langford shut her down in the meeting." But even Langford, back at his desk, wasn't laughing. He sat quietly, tapping a pen against the edge of his keyboard, staring at the printouts Elena had distributed earlier. Her projections were solid. Her data was airtight. And that final slide, "Progress requires discomfort," it hadn't left his head, because no one had ever said it so plainly to his face before. And certainly not someone like her. In another corner office, David Marshall watched the storm unfold from a higher altitude. He heard the rumors. He recognized the tension. And he did nothing to stop it, because he knew Elena didn't need protection. She needed space. And soon, the very people who questioned her would be the ones fighting to keep up. By 3 p.m., the company's Slack channels had their own coded chatter. Inside jokes, subtle digs. A thread titled "The Restructuring Queen" appeared, anonymous, sarcastic, and soaked in fear. Elena saw it. She scrolled once, smirked, and then went back to her calendar. Because while they played games, she was making moves. Her next meeting wasn't about defending herself. It was with legal, reviewing contracts and identifying redundancies in middle management. She wasn't fighting to be heard. She was clearing the path to replace the ones who wouldn't listen. By the time the clock struck noon, the office was buzzing, not with productivity, but with speculation. The presentation was over, but the backlash had only just begun. In the break room, at standing desks, and in hushed hallway corners, the whispers took on a life of their own. No one dared say anything directly to Elena's face, but behind closed doors, the knives came out. "Who does she think she is?" One exec muttered over a salad he wasn't really eating. "Just waltzes in here with a flashy title and starts telling us how to run our departments." "I heard she didn't even come from inside the company," another replied, leaning in like he was sharing state secrets. "Probably one of those high-paid consultants who thinks they know everything." A third voice, lower and more venomous. "Let's be honest. It's a diversity hire. They needed to check a box and make the board happy. That's all this is." The words hung in the air like cigarette smoke, toxic, lingering, and hard to ignore. None of them knew Elena had graduated top of her class from Wharton. None of them knew she had been named Strategist of the Year by 2 different business journals. None of them knew she'd led the turnaround of not one, but 2 Fortune 500 companies, dragging them back from the edge of bankruptcy and into profitability. They didn't know because they hadn't bothered to ask. They hadn't read her resume. They hadn't read the internal memo David Marshall had sent out weeks ago, announcing her appointment and outlining her background, her experience, her accolades, her unmatched ability to fix what others had failed to see. No, because in their minds, none of that mattered. To them, she was an outsider, a woman in a power seat they believed they deserved, a black woman in a position they couldn't justify. Not in their heads, not in their culture, not in their narrative of who gets to lead. So instead of facing that truth, they whispered. Like children too afraid to confront the storm, they huddled together, hoping their doubt would drown her out. But Elena, she didn't waste a breath trying to correct them. She didn't send follow-up emails clarifying her credentials. She didn't engage in some public relations campaign to prove her worth. She let them whisper, let them second-guess, Because Elena understood something they didn't. Power doesn't panic. She knew who she was. She knew what she was capable of. And she knew that the louder the whispers got, the more threatened they were by her presence. The same men who mocked her were now checking her LinkedIn profiles on private tabs. They were digging through company files to understand how she got there, searching for anything that would make them feel less unsettled. But they found nothing, because everything she had, she earned. And deep down, that terrified them. Back in her office, a sleek, quiet space 2 doors down from the CEO himself, Elena sat with her notebook open, not scribbling defensively, not reacting emotionally, but planning. Because while they whispered, she strategized. While they speculated, she executed. Elena wasn't concerned with being liked. She wasn't here to win over egos or ask for validation from people who had coasted on comfort and cronyism. She was here to fix the mess they didn't want to admit they'd made. Across the building, the conversations escalated. "I'd give her 2 weeks." One director laughed as he poured himself another coffee. "Once she realizes we don't play nice, she'll run." "She's already out of her depth," another added. "You saw Langford shut her down in the meeting." But even Langford, back at his desk, wasn't laughing. He sat quietly, tapping a pen against the edge of his keyboard, staring at the printouts Elena had distributed earlier. Her projections were solid. Her data was airtight. And that final slide, "Progress requires discomfort," it hadn't left his head, because no one had ever said it so plainly to his face before. And certainly not someone like her. In another corner office, David Marshall watched the storm unfold from a higher altitude. He heard the rumors. He recognized the tension. And he did nothing to stop it, because he knew Elena didn't need protection. She needed space. And soon, the very people who questioned her would be the ones fighting to keep up. By 3 p.m., the company's Slack channels had their own coded chatter. Inside jokes, subtle digs. A thread titled "The Restructuring Queen" appeared, anonymous, sarcastic, and soaked in fear. Elena saw it. She scrolled once, smirked, and then went back to her calendar. Because while they played games, she was making moves. Her next meeting wasn't about defending herself. It was with legal, reviewing contracts and identifying redundancies in middle management. She wasn't fighting to be heard. She was clearing the path to replace the ones who wouldn't listen. While the whispers raged and eyes continued to roll, Elena Ross went silent, at least in the public eye. To most of the executives at Beckett and Rowe, it seemed as if she'd simply faded into the background. After all, she wasn't attending the after-work drinks. She wasn't trying to squeeze into their circles, and she certainly wasn't showing up to grovel or prove herself. But behind the scenes, she was everywhere. Unannounced, Elena began visiting every floor of the company. Not just the marble-wrapped executive suites, but the overlooked apartments buried in the company's midsection. She walked the rows of cubicles in HR, sat in the call center with junior agents, and even spent an hour with the janitorial staff as they cleaned out supply closets after hours. She wasn't there to give speeches. She was there to listen, clipboard in hand, notebook always ready. She asked simple questions, the kind no executive had bothered to ask in years. What's slowing your team down the most? Where do you feel your work gets ignored? If you could fix one thing about this company tomorrow, what would it be? She sat with customer service reps and heard about the clunky software they were forced to use. Software that hadn't been updated in 5 years because someone up top had called it good enough. She heard from facilities managers who described inventory systems that required 3 times the paperwork of modern tools. She even learned from the janitorial team that entire departments were hoarding equipment to avoid filing the required forms for replacements. Every meeting, every hallway conversation, every 5-minute chat in the elevator, it was a brick. And Elena was building something. A blueprint. A real strategy, grounded not in boardroom theory, but in the actual pulse of the company. Meanwhile, the executive team barely noticed. They were too busy trying to track her next move, assuming she was off somewhere sulking, plotting revenge for being sidelined. They were half right, but revenge wasn't her style. Results were, and they were coming. Her changes started small, almost invisible, but they were targeted, and they hit hard. She rewrote hiring policies to focus on role relevance instead of connections. No more referral hires, sliding into jobs they weren't qualified for. No more bloated middle management hoarding junior staff like trophies. She streamlined workflows using off-the-shelf software that cost a fraction of what the firm was paying their long-term vendor. She approved budget reallocations that let high-performing departments expand without waiting for quarterly begging sessions. Then came the audits. Quiet, thorough departmental audits that revealed inefficiencies no one wanted to talk about, including the fact that some directors hadn't met their KPIs in 6 quarters, but were still pulling bonuses. Within weeks, things started shifting. Customer complaints dropped. Task completion times shortened. Employee engagement, something that had flatlined under the last strategy director, began climbing. And most importantly, profits started to rise. It was Langford who noticed first. Flipping through the quarterly projections one morning, he squinted, then flipped back again. Wait a minute. He pulled up the latest numbers and blinked twice. Sales are up this quarter. One of his analysts nodded. 4.8%. We haven't seen that kind of jump in over a year. Langford leaned back in his leather chair, frowning. It didn't make sense. There had been no major campaigns, no new product launches, no massive budget hikes. But the numbers didn't lie. So he picked up the phone and called a meeting with Elena. She arrived precisely on time. Calm, composed, her brown leather notebook in hand. Same as always. I wanted to ask you about these numbers, Langford said, tapping the reports. Sales, retention, even client satisfaction. You have any idea what's driving this? Yes, Elena replied without flinching. We're operating more efficiently. We've resolved 3 major pain points in the client funnel, and we're on track to double client retention over the next 2 quarters. Langford blinked. You did this. I built the structure, she said evenly. The employees already had the answers. I just cleared the way. It was the first time he looked at her, really looked at her, without the wall of ego between them. He nodded once. Impressive. But it wasn't respect. Not yet. It was reluctant acknowledgement. A crack in the armor. Enough to make him curious, but not humble. And the others? They noticed, too. Slowly, Elena started getting copied on more emails, invited to more planning sessions. Her office became a stop-in spot for junior staff and managers looking for real answers, not corporate talk. But there was still resistance. Executives praised the results without crediting the architect. They talked about the team's hard work without naming the one person who had restructured the entire foundation of their success. It didn't matter to Elena because she wasn't chasing applause. She was building proof. And with every metric that improved, every quarter that exceeded expectations, the proof got louder. Louder than the whispers. Louder than the skepticism. Louder than the disrespect. They still didn't fully respect her, but they had started listening. And Elena knew, listening always came first. Respect? That was next. It began with a number. A single line on a quarterly report that didn't sit right with Elena. A vendor expense, labeled consulting services, that had ballooned inexplicably over the past 3 quarters. Most people wouldn't have noticed. Most didn't want to. But Elena Ross wasn't most people. She had trained her mind to catch inconsistencies the way a conductor hears a wrong note in an orchestra. And this number was screaming. Instead of raising alarm bells in front of the whole firm, Elena did what she always did. She moved in silence. She stayed late in the office, long after the rest had cleared out for drinks and dinners. She requested internal invoices, cross-checked vendor logs, and dug through the company's digital archives. She printed receipts, downloaded contracts, and built a wall of documentation. Within a week, the puzzle was complete, and it was damning. What Elena uncovered wasn't just a budgeting oversight. It was a multi-million-dollar discrepancy. A shell vendor created under a real-sounding name, contracted for strategic consulting, but delivering 0 tangible output. Payments had been processed quarterly, rubber-stamped by none other than CFO Thomas Langford. Elena didn't gloat. She didn't rush to broadcast her findings. She did what real leaders do. She brought the truth quietly to those who needed to hear it. She scheduled a private meeting with the board's audit committee. No flair. No grandstanding. Just facts. She walked in with a locked briefcase and walked out, leaving the room in stunned silence. The audit was launched that same day. And for the first time in years, Langford looked nervous. At first, he brushed it off, claiming it was an error. Clerical mishap, he said with a laugh that didn't quite reach his eyes. Happens all the time. But when the internal team reviewed the files Elena had handed over, full of paper trails, email authorizations, and contract approval stamps with his signature, the smiles vanished. The board called an emergency session. Langford, cornered and combative, tried to deflect. "She's framing me," he said, pacing the room. "This is personal. She's been after me since day one." But Elena didn't need to defend herself. She simply stood, opened her briefcase, and calmly presented time-stamped financial reports, vendor emails with his direct replies, a security log proving the contracts had been uploaded from his work computer. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't accuse. She just let the evidence speak. And it screamed. There was no saving face. By Friday, Langford's resignation hit inboxes across the firm with a sterile subject line: leadership transition announcement. He was gone. Just like that. But the ripple was enormous. Executives who had once snickered when she walked into a room now stood when she entered. They greeted her with forced respect, tight smiles, carefully measured tones. "Good morning, Miss Ross," they'd say now, their voices no longer dripping with sarcasm. It wasn't warmth. It wasn't sudden admiration. But it was silence, the stunned kind that only comes after power shifts. Behind closed doors, they whispered a different kind of rumor now. She took down Langford. She's not just strategy, she's cleanup. She has the board's ear. And in truth, she did. Because the board, once skeptical of David Marshall's bold appointment, now leaned into her every recommendation. Her quarterly reports became must-reads. Her department's meetings suddenly had full attendance. People began requesting to join her team. Because Elena had done what no one else had dared. She confronted the rot hiding beneath the firm's polished exterior. She exposed a man they had long protected. And she had done it by the book. No shortcuts. No drama. No leaks to the press. Just quiet precision. Even David Marshall was impressed. He sent a single-line email later that night. "This is why I hired you." Elena didn't reply. She didn't need to, because the results were speaking louder than applause ever could. By Monday morning, the culture of the company had already begun to shift. Langford's office was stripped bare, his name removed from the executive roster. His allies went silent, afraid to be next. And Elena, she didn't gloat, didn't take a victory lap. She just got back to work. Her team was already deep into the next phase of restructuring, and she had a presentation to finalize. But across every hallway and department, the message was clear. Elena Ross wasn't a placeholder. She wasn't a diversity hire. She wasn't some soft-spoken strategist you could laugh out of a meeting. She was a force, a quiet storm that didn't need thunder to announce its arrival. And the firm had just learned, the hard way, what happened when you underestimated her. 2 days after Langford's sudden resignation, the boardroom buzzed again, but this time, not with arrogance or laughter. It was tension. It clung to the air like humidity before a storm. Executives filed into their leather chairs a bit more carefully now. There was no backslapping, no loud jokes, just cautious glances and quiet whispers. They had all seen what Elena was capable of, and more importantly, how she had done it. Clean, strategic, undeniable. At exactly 9 a.m., CEO David Marshall entered the room and stood at the head of the table. Elena Ross was already seated. Not at the head, not yet, but close enough that every eye flicked her way. Marshall didn't waste time. He placed a folder on the table, looked out at the group, and cleared his throat. "I'll get right to it," he said, his tone calm but decisive. "We've been through a major transition. We've had to ask tough questions and make even tougher decisions." He paused, letting the gravity settle. And throughout it all, one person has not only kept us steady, she's made us stronger. The room shifted. Chairs squeaked. Throats cleared. They knew where this was going. They just didn't think it would come this fast. I'm officially appointing Elena Ross as our permanent chief strategy officer, Marshall said, effective immediately. For a second, the room was silent, frozen. Then came the applause, soft, stuttered, like a group trying to figure out if clapping was the right move. Some clapped out of genuine recognition, others out of fear. But it didn't matter to Elena. She wasn't here to win a popularity contest. She was here to lead. She stood, calm, composed, wearing the same sharp navy suit that had become her quiet signature. "No speech," she said, her voice steady. "Just results. Let's get to work." It was all she needed to say, because her results were the speech, and everyone in that room had heard it loud and clear. Some executives averted their eyes, still unsure how to react to a woman they dismissed just weeks ago, the one they'd mistaken for catering, the one they had whispered about in hallways, laughed at over drinks. Now, she stood with authority not granted by a title, but earned by action. And she wasn't done. As she took her new seat, the seat at the head of the table, the shift was palpable. She wasn't just occupying space anymore. She was commanding it. That simple act, sliding into the chair where Langford once lounged with smug confidence, sent a message more powerful than any announcement ever could. This company had changed, and she had changed it. From that point forward, the board meetings looked different. She led with precision. Every data point had a purpose. Every slide was backed by employee insights, client feedback, and a keen understanding of how to merge vision with execution. There was no fluff, no ego, just strategy. And slowly, the tight applause started turning into real nods, real agreement, because the numbers spoke. Client retention was up 28%. Employee turnover had dropped for the first time in 2 years. And several top-tier clients, who had been quietly exploring other firms, renewed their contracts with long-term commitments. Still, not everyone was sold. There were quiet holdouts, senior partners who couldn't accept that the most effective leader in the building didn't look, speak, or operate like the ones before her. But even they couldn't argue with the transformation happening around them. Projects that had stalled for quarters were suddenly hitting milestones. Departments once buried in bureaucracy were now moving with speed and clarity. People were working smarter, and with more pride. The ripple effect was undeniable. Outside of the boardroom, employees began talking about her differently. She listens. She's smart, not just book smart, but people smart. She actually gets what we do. Her promotion wasn't just a title change. It was a cultural pivot, a statement to every woman, every person of color, every underestimated talent in the company. There was space at the top, and it could be earned through excellence, not legacy. But Elena didn't post about it on LinkedIn. She didn't give interviews. She didn't boast. She simply worked. Every single day. She still walked the floors, still met with junior staff, still kept her office door open, because she hadn't forgotten what it felt like to be ignored, underestimated, dismissed. She just didn't let it define her. She let her results do that. And they did, over and over again. So while the old guard murmured about how fast her rise had been, the smart ones knew the truth. She hadn't risen fast. They had just been too slow to notice. The sun had dipped below the skyline when Elena Ross finally returned to her office that evening. The glass walls reflected the city lights as if the world outside was watching, waiting. It had been a long day, one filled with board meetings, congratulations, thinly veiled envy, and the pressure of knowing her seat at the head of the table wasn't just symbolic. It was a statement, and statements, she knew, had to be followed by something even more powerful, clarity. She sat down at her desk. No assistant, no one standing behind her with coffee or files, just her and the quiet hum of her thoughts. She opened her laptop and clicked compose. 2. All staff subject. Value and voice. She stared at the blinking cursor, then began to type. Not as an executive, not as someone trying to impress, but as a woman who had walked through fire and kept her grace intact. In the weeks I've been here, many greeted me with silence, some with laughter. But I was not here to be liked. I was here to listen, learn, and lead. Her fingers moved steadily across the keys. I observed this company not from the corner office, but from the lunchrooms, the side desks, the overlooked spaces. I saw brilliance buried under bureaucracy. I saw loyalty unrecognized. I saw ideas whispered in fear rather than spoken with confidence. She paused, then added, "This company is changing, and it must, because if the future only looks like the past, we will lose. Let this be a place where no one is ignored, and no potential is overlooked." She ended with what she had felt in her soul since the very first day. Silent power is still power. She hit send, and the digital wave began. Within minutes, inboxes pinged from the basement mailroom to the executive floor. A few staffers reading it on their phones stopped mid-step in the hallways. Some reread it twice. Others forwarded it immediately. Subject line intact, message untouched. By midnight, the email had been reshared more than any internal memo in the company's entire history. It wasn't just a message. It was a mirror. People saw themselves in it. The receptionist who was never acknowledged by senior partners, the analyst whose ideas were stolen by louder voices, the assistant who was always first in and last out, but never thanked. For once, someone in power wasn't just telling them what to do. She was telling them they mattered. In departments across the firm, hushed conversations started to shift. People who had never spoken directly to Elena were quoting her. "Did you read what she said? That part about silent power, that hit." Even those who had doubted her, especially them, felt something stir. The old guard, the suits who had clapped with clenched jaws during her promotion announcement, opened her email and reread it in silence. It wasn't angry. It wasn't petty. It was measured. A scalpel, not a hammer. And that's what made it sting. They had laughed at her. They had underestimated her. And she hadn't responded with fury. She responded with vision. Some scrambled to craft replies they hoped would sound thoughtful. "Incredible insight. Thank you for sharing, Elena. Truly inspiring words. Appreciate your leadership." But she wasn't looking for applause. She didn't send the email to be celebrated. She sent it to shift the culture. And it was working. The next morning, the office felt different. Not louder. Not chaotic. Just awake. Assistants who had long felt invisible were suddenly greeted by name. Junior staff, who had hesitated to speak up in meetings, started raising their hands. Managers took a second look at the resumes they might have previously dismissed. Because Elena's words weren't just motivational, they were a challenge. A quiet dare. "What kind of company do you want this to be?" In the days that followed, posters quoting the email began appearing on bulletin boards and screensavers, some official, some homemade. Silent power is still power. No potential overlooked. Not here to be liked. Here to lead. And perhaps the most shared line of all. Let this be a place where no one is ignored. It became a rallying cry. Not for the loud, but for the overlooked. Not for the already powerful, but for those who had spent years shrinking themselves to survive. Even David Marshall, the CEO, forwarded the message to external partners with one simple sentence. "This is who we are now." And just like that, Elena's voice, once ignored, once laughed at, became the tone of a new era. Not just for the company, but for everyone who had ever been underestimated. It didn't happen overnight, but it happened. In the months following Elena Ross's promotion and that unforgettable email titled Value and Voice, the very soul of Beckett and Rowe began to change, quietly, steadily, and unmistakably. It started in the hiring rooms. For years, those spaces had been echo chambers, stacked with the same kinds of resumes from the same schools, reviewed by the same tired eyes. But suddenly, new voices joined the panel. HR brought in staff from different departments, different levels, and different lived experiences. People who didn't just know how to spot qualifications, but potential. The old script was tossed out. No more one-size-fits-all definitions of professionalism. No more coded language about someone not fitting the culture. Because now, the culture was being rewritten, and it all traced back to one woman, Elena. But she never claimed credit. While others adjusted to the shift, she kept her head down and her standards high. She didn't take long lunches or bask in applause. She showed up early, stayed late, and remained razor-sharp in every decision. People took notice. More importantly, people mirrored her. Managers who used to lead with ego started leading with intention. They scheduled one-on-ones not to micromanage, but to mentor. They listened. They asked better questions. Some even admitted they had been part of the problem and committed to doing better. The culture of competition began to bend into something new: collaboration. In break rooms, the energy softened. Staff who once avoided speaking up now laughed freely, knowing their ideas wouldn't be dismissed as too junior or off-brand. Brainstorming sessions grew louder, more inclusive. People leaned in, not just to hear, but to understand. Even the office aesthetics changed. The stark, sterile decor that once screamed intimidation was replaced with soft lighting, art from local Black and Indigenous artists, and quiet nooks meant for reflection and thought, not surveillance. There was no memo announcing these changes. They simply unfolded, because when leadership evolves, culture follows. And at the heart of it all was Elena. She wasn't on the company's homepage. She didn't star in recruitment ads. But her impact stretched across every floor, every desk, every whispered conversation that began with, "Did you hear what she implemented this week?" Still, Elena remained Elena. She didn't smile for praise or gloat in victory. Her confidence wasn't loud. It was rooted, unshakable. When someone thanked her in a meeting, she redirected the spotlight to the team. When a partner tried to overstep boundaries, she shut it down with facts, not fury. Her power didn't need theatrics. It lived in the decisions she made, the people she elevated, and the silence she turned into something electric. And the silence did change. Where once it had been a weapon used against her, cold, dismissive, isolating, it became her armor, her signal, her thunder. Now, when she walked into a room, people stood, not out of fear, out of respect. The same executives who had once chuckled when she introduced herself now rose quietly when she entered, not because it was required, but because no one dared stay seated when Elena Ross was in the room. And she didn't need to say a word. Her presence was enough. Even outside the firm, word spread. Competing firms called, asking for consultation. Universities reached out to invite her to speak. A best-selling author referenced her in a chapter about transformational leadership. She declined most of it because her mission hadn't changed. She wasn't here for the spotlight. She was here for the work. And inside the company, the ripple effects continued. Retention rates hit historic highs. A record number of interns accepted full-time roles. And the company's annual review, usually a routine PR piece, featured something new: employee stories. Real voices. Real growth. One of them, a young data analyst named Priya, wrote, "When I joined, I was afraid to speak. I thought I had to shrink to fit in. But now, I'm part of a project team that values my insight, and that change started when someone powerful chose to listen instead of lecture." Another wrote simply, "Silent power changed everything." Elena never responded to those stories publicly. She didn't need to, but her team noticed a slight smile when she read them, alone in her office, late at night. She kept a printout of one pinned inside her notebook. It reminded her why she came, why she stayed, and why she'd never needed to raise her voice to make herself heard. Because in a world that too often confuses noise with leadership, Elena Ross proved something radical. You don't have to be loud to be powerful. You don't have to dominate to lead. You just have to know who you are, and never let anyone else define that for you. And that is how the culture at Beckett and Rowe didn't just shift. It evolved. Because one woman refused to let arrogance, sexism, or silence bury her. And in doing so, she helped an entire company rise. Years passed since that pivotal moment in the boardroom. The moment when Elena Ross walked into a room full of doubt and ridicule, only to leave behind a legacy of silent power that reshaped an entire company. The whispers of her triumphs faded into the background of a new era at Beckett and Rowe. But Elena, she didn't need to be part of the spotlight. She was too busy creating it for others. Now, a few years later, Elena sat on a stage at a national leadership conference, the lights bright above her and an audience of thousands below. She was poised, calm, and collected, a woman who had once been the new hire, but had grown into one of the most respected figures in the business world. Her career had expanded far beyond Beckett and Rowe, and now she was sharing the lessons she had learned along the way. As the Q&A session began, a young intern raised her hand, nervously glancing around before speaking up. "How did you handle being humiliated in that room?" the intern asked. The question hung in the air, a poignant reminder of the very moment that had defined Elena's rise. The room fell silent, the crowd eager to hear the answer. The intern's words were simple, but they carried the weight of every young professional who had ever felt underestimated, overlooked, or dismissed. Elena paused for a moment, letting the question settle. She could have taken the moment to revel in her success, to recount how sweet it felt to prove everyone wrong, to gloat about her victory over those who had once doubted her. But she didn't. Instead, her lips curled into a soft, knowing smile, one that carried the weight of experience and the grace of someone who had truly learned what leadership meant. "I didn't let their ignorance become my identity," Elena said quietly, her voice steady but powerful. "I let results speak louder than revenge, and that made all the difference." The audience was still, hanging on every word. Elena's response wasn't just a reflection of the past. It was a philosophy she had lived by since day one. Her ability to rise above the petty slights, the microaggressions, and the overt acts of dismissal had always been rooted in one fundamental truth: that success, not bitterness, would be her greatest weapon. She leaned forward slightly, her hands resting on the podium as she continued. "I wasn't interested in proving people wrong," she said. "That's a trap. The moment you start trying to prove someone wrong, you make their opinion more important than your own vision. No, I was interested in proving what was possible. I was interested in making sure the work spoke for itself." Elena's words resonated deeply with the audience, and there was a collective shift in the room, a realization that the path to leadership wasn't about fighting against others. It was about standing firm in your own truth and letting your actions define you. She had made that choice early on in her journey, and it was that choice that had ultimately led her to where she stood now. "It wasn't easy, of course," she continued. "There were moments where I wanted to fire back, where I wanted to prove my worth with every word. But I knew that if I did that, I'd be playing on their terms, not mine. I'd be allowing their narrow vision to shape my future." She paused, allowing the weight of her words to sink in. "No one can define you unless you let them," she said softly. "Not the people who mock you, not the systems that seek to silence you. Only you can define who you are and what you're capable of." Elena's gaze swept across the room, meeting the eyes of the young intern who had asked the question. "It's easy to get caught up in the idea of revenge," she said. "We all want to get back at the people who hurt us, the ones who underestimated us. But I can promise you this: revenge never builds anything worth having." The crowd was completely captivated now, hanging on her every word. Elena's calm, deliberate delivery spoke volumes. She wasn't just telling them what she had done. She was showing them a way forward. The room wasn't just filled with people listening to a speaker. It was filled with people inspired to act. "I chose to focus on results," Elena said. "Every project I worked on, every challenge I faced, I focused on delivering results. Not just for me, but for the people I worked with, the ones who believed in the vision, the ones who saw what was possible even when others couldn't." She took a breath, letting the room settle into the truth of her statement. "Results are the ultimate response to doubt," she said. "Because when you deliver, when you show that you can take something broken and make it better, when you build something that lasts, not with words, but with action, that's when you stop being invisible. That's when the noise of doubt becomes just that, noise. And you become the echo that shapes the future." The audience was spellbound. Elena wasn't just speaking to them. She was speaking with them. She was giving them the tools they needed to navigate a world that often didn't understand or appreciate their value. She was showing them how to transform silence into power. "There's no formula for success," she said, leaning back slightly. "But there's a choice. The choice to rise above the noise. The choice to take the high road, even when it feels impossible. And the choice to let your work speak for itself." The room erupted into applause, not the kind that comes with obligation, but the kind that comes from deep admiration. Elena had just laid out a blueprint for leadership that wasn't built on aggression, arrogance, or ego, but on quiet strength, resilience, and unwavering conviction. As the applause died down, Elena's smile remained calm, humble, and thoughtful. "Thank you," she said softly, before stepping back from the podium, her presence still commanding the room. "Now, go out there and do the work. Let your results speak for you." And just like that, Elena Ross, who had once been humiliated in a room full of doubters, left behind a legacy that would echo for years to come. Elena Ross's journey was not one of loud confrontations or dramatic displays of power. Instead, it was a quiet rebellion against the norms that sought to silence her. The road she walked was not always paved with applause or validation. In fact, she faced mockery, disregard, and discrimination from the moment she stepped into Beckett and Rowe. But what made her different from the others wasn't just her resilience. It was her ability to remain steadfast, to never let the noise of others drown out the sound of her own potential. From the moment she was dismissed by the executives in that boardroom, Elena chose a different path. She understood that the loudest voices in the room weren't always the ones worth listening to, and that true power doesn't need to shout to be heard. Instead of clapping back with snarky remarks or petty retaliation, Elena used her silence as strength. She worked tirelessly behind the scenes, listening, learning, and crafting a strategy that no one could ignore. Her ability to remain composed in the face of dismissal and disrespect wasn't a sign of weakness. It was a testament to her inner strength. It was a quiet, unwavering resolve that no matter how much they tried to undermine her, Elena was here to make change, not seek approval. Her focus was never on proving the doubters wrong. It was about proving what was possible when a leader refuses to be distracted by noise. As her influence grew within the company, so did the respect of those around her. The same people who once laughed when she entered the room now stood when she walked in, not out of obligation, but out of respect for the person she had become and the legacy she was building. Through her strategic mind and quiet determination, Elena had transformed Beckett and Rowe into a company that no longer feared change, but welcomed it. But even as she ascended to the role of Chief Strategy Officer, Elena remained grounded. She wasn't interested in the title or the accolades. What mattered to her was the impact she was making, not just for herself, but for every employee who had ever felt overlooked. She didn't want to be the hero of the story. She wanted to be the catalyst for everyone's success. Her legacy wasn't one that could be captured in a single moment. It was a series of small, deliberate actions, quiet yet powerful, that changed a company and inspired an entire generation of professionals. And it all began with one decision: to let results speak louder than revenge. Years later, as Elena stood on that stage at the National Leadership Conference, she wasn't just speaking to an audience. She was speaking to everyone who had ever been underestimated, ignored, or humiliated. She was telling them that they, too, could rise, that they, too, could lead without shouting for attention, that their silent strength could be the thunder that changed everything. And just like that, Elena Ross had become more than a leader. She had become a symbol of quiet power, a reminder that sometimes the loudest voices are the ones that have the least to say. The true leaders? They speak with their actions, their integrity, and the results they deliver. Her legacy was clear. In a world full of noise, Elena's silence was her thunder, and that thunder would echo long after she had left the room.